All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Like I said, we're recording this so people who are coming in late can catch most of what we're doing for today. I'll go over pretty briefly today some of the logistics, since I believe the people who are on the call have been here already been here for part of the session. But welcome to the last day of the Cross Research Symposium. Our annual research symposium, our first time doing it completely online. It's, I think, been pretty successful so far, and I'm expecting to continue successful. Then for the last day, we have some really interesting workshops coming up in the afternoon on particularly focus on open source hardware. So this is our open source hardware day. And I also am looking forward to the keynote that'll start in a bit by Heath Arensen from the Digital Impact Alliance. But I'm just gonna go through some of the logistical issues to make sure if there's anyone new hasn't joined us before today, just know how to find everything. So first off, the symposium website has links to pretty much everything you're gonna need for today. It has the agenda. It has links to the agenda, then has links to all the sessions where you would find the bio and the bios and the abstracts for the talks. Also, the links to Heath's session. So his abstract and his bio are there. I put up the participant survey, and I really appreciate any feedback you can give. This is, again, the first time we've done it in this format. And this is true for a lot of people I know. And a lot of symposiums, this is the first time they've gone all remote. And so we'd like to get some feedback. Our hope is, of course, to at some point do this live again, do this in person again. But if, depending on how things work out, maybe there's a way of doing this in a hybrid format. So the feedback we get on how we handled this remote session is very, very useful to us. There's also a link on the website to our new cross merchandise, which is these beautiful t-shirts and sweatshirts with a design by our very own Lavinia Preston. And you can feel free to use that link to go there and order. And if you have any problems with ordering, let us know. There's also the Symposium Slack channel, which is where I've been pinning all the important documents that you've been needing for the last few days, where I'm posting pinning all of the, I'm linking all of the videos from the previous sessions. So at the end of the day, I've been able to get all of them pretty much up there. So if you saw anything you're interested in but missed it from, you missed it, go ahead and go to the Slack channel and you should be able to find a link. And if you can't find the link, just let me know. And also, what Slack is good for, random but relevant info from participants want to share, and just any other discussions about the sessions and the topics. Just a quick reminder that we're not using the regular chat function for questions to speakers while the presentation's going on. We're using the symposium minutes, and I will try to pop the link to those minutes in the chat, before we get started with Heath. But we're using the chat primarily for logistical issues and technical questions, but then content questions for the speakers should go into the minutes. And then the speakers, especially like today's keynote is pre-recorded, so Heath can actually follow any questions you have and answer live. And again, if you don't see the agenda in the chat, the link in the chat, it is on the agenda and it is on the Slack channel. If you have questions throughout the day, or if you have questions later next week when you're looking for a video or pre-recorded, anything, any of the recordings or any other information about about what happened this week, go ahead and shoot me an email. if you have my personal email address, go for that too. But our general one is crossinfo@ucsc.edu, and that will hit myself, Lavinia, and Carlos as well. And again, for those who know Carlos and have noticed he hasn't been here this week, he unfortunately had a family emergency in Germany and has had to fly there early this week, and so has unfortunately missed the symposium this year. Again, you can email us, you can message us on the Slack channel, that'll be open for quite a while. And again, those are where the links are going to be, so a quick place to find it. And you can always just send me a quick Zoom chat. Sometimes when I've noticed when the videos are running, because they're running off my computer, I don't see it right away, but go ahead and chat. I normally will see it and be able to respond. And if you're looking for me on the chat, I look when I have don't have my video on, my chat is the my Zoom icon is the BSOE slug, so easy to find. I wanted today to talk, I'm happy that we have Holger Schmidt from BSOE, who will be giving welcoming remarks. And I just want to remind everybody, since it's hard to really see that on remotely, but you can see my background here, that we are at BSOE at UC Santa Cruz, so the Baskin School of Engineering, as where we're situated. And if we were doing this live, we would be there in the courtyard at BSOE in front of Engineering 2, and set up our posters and all of our our registration and our great food that normally we provide for this event. So, but I wanted to highlight that it's important that we are how centered we are with BSOE and how much their support does mean to us. And all of our students are obviously BSOE graduate students. All of our incubators are PhD students from BSOE. Our incubated fellows are PhD students from BSOE, and we really highly appreciate the assistance and the support, and both financially and with academically and intellectually, the support we get from BSOE. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Holger Schmidt, who is the Narinder Singh Kanpay Chair of Optoelectronics and a professor of electrical and computer engineering here at Baskin School of Engineering. And he also directs the WM Keck Center for Nanoscale Optofluidics. And he's welcoming you today here in his role as the Baskin School of Engineering Associate Dean for Research. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and thanks for inviting me and giving me a chance to say a few words on this last day of this symposium. And I'm happy to extend a welcome for today on behalf of our Dean, Alex Wolf, and of the School of Engineering in general. And I would just like to say a few words first about sort of general remarks and then about CROSS in particular. And from my perspective as an Associate Dean of Research, I'm happy to say that we've had a very successful year this year in the past fiscal year, 1920 for research at UC Santa Cruz and in this Baskin School of Engineering in particular. So for example, UC Santa Cruz has been added as a member of the AAU, which if you don't know is a distinct group of the top 65 US research universities. And in Baskin School of Engineering, this year we have attracted research funding to support our projects in the amount of about $46 million, which is a record and an increase of 36% compared to the prior year, which in light of COVID is perhaps even more impressive. In addition to support for our research projects, our faculty and their work are getting increased attention and recognition, and we're very happy to report that we have had 2 NSF Career Awards this year in the Computer Science and Engineering Department, and 2 Test of Time Awards for recognizing truly influential papers by our faculty. And 3 of our faculty were elected fellows of the IEEE, the ACM, and the National Academy of Inventors, respectively. To accelerate our research activities, we have very active research centers in the school, which both highlight the research areas of strategic importance to the school and also really help connect different departments, which is a very important component of creating cohesiveness across the school and fostering intellectual interaction. For example, we've added the Genomics Institute this year as an organized research unit, or ORU, and then the IBSC, the Institute for the Biology of Stem Cells, as another focused research activity center. CROSS, of course, is one of our more established centers, as you know, and as such, it really is a central pillar of our research activities in its space. CROSS has had a particular focus on enabling a diverse set of Baskin School of Engineering students and researchers to enable technology transfer and strengthen our ability to continue being a beacon of innovation and attract and fund really talented grad students. And we also really welcome the many industry partners that have registered for Symposium, and we really reach out to them to partner with CROSS and the Baskin School of Engineering at large to support additional research. We really and particularly appreciate CROSS's current industry members, Kyoshiya, Seagate, and Fujitsu, and I would like to acknowledge their ongoing support for CROSS projects. Now, CROSS has been pioneering efforts to introduce open source software strategies and techniques in academia. It enables our students to follow a career path that's similar to Sage Wiles, who created the Ceph storage system as part of his PhD work at UCSC. CROSS provides, similarly, BSE students looking to become open source leaders and experts with the knowledge and support to get systems built and the understanding of how to find the right tools and technologies to develop these skills. In the past 5 years since CROSS was started, it has funded the work of 13 grad students and 4 postgraduate researchers from 8 different research groups and 4 Baskin School of Engineering departments: computer science and engineering, electrical and computer engineering, applied mathematics, and computational media. And I think that's a really excellent example of how CROSS as a research center does a great job of connecting many different departments, in this case 4 of our 6 departments in the school. Of course, CROSS funds projects related to both open source software and hardware. As Stephanie pointed out, today's symposium workshops focus on 2 separate open source hardware projects funded by CROSS from different research groups within BSOE. And these projects really highlight the growing importance of open source hardware and how CROSS's support is helping spur innovation at BSOE. I think with that, I should conclude and let you get on with the program and an exciting keynote talk. And I hope you enjoy the remainder of the symposium. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Holger. I really appreciate you coming in and opening for us. And again, yes, we very much appreciate the support from BSOE, but also, again, the being able to have such a vibrant group of students and researchers that we work with and faculty we work with through BSOE is really an important part of why I think CROSS is so successful. So thank you again. I'm going to give a few minutes just before we move on to Heath to do a quick thank you to a number of people that really made this possible. And again, BSOE in general, we think because of all the facilities and everything, even what's going on the remote facilities is due to the fact that, BSOE supports us and UCSC has, a good certain IT support that's really helpful. Let's see if I can get to my next. So the Symposium team for this year, who I want to reach out to and thank, and some of who I think are on the call, include, and since this is the last time we meet as a plenary, I wanted to try and make sure I get this in now. So I want to thank definitely all our keynote speakers, Heath, of course, who's on the call, but Lisa from Monday, Spencer from Tuesday, sorry, not Monday, Lisa from Tuesday, and then Spencer and Dawn from yesterday. They were all great speakers. And again, all of their talks are available online if you missed any of them. And it was definitely a really good set of keynotes this year. Our workshop chairs and speakers were great, and particularly our chairs who had to deal with all my emails going back and forth with different instructions, and they all handled it really well and did everything that I asked them for. And I really appreciate all the help that they did. And the reason why this this remote version is so successful is their work, their intellectual work, and they're just getting a really good group of speakers together for all their workshops, and I really appreciate them. And then the speakers themselves have been just great. I want to do a special thank you to our open source research experience students and their mentors for all the work they did over the summer, for the presentations, which I thought were actually spectacular. I gave them 5 to 6 minutes to tell everything that they did over the summer. And I said, you know, that's all you got. And they all gave really good, concise talks. They really highlighted the work that they did as for our projects, as contributors to our projects. And then the mentors that worked with them, so those are our research or incubator fellows who supported their work over the summer. They were great and lent support and made sure that, you know, they were ready for their lightning talks and their poster sessions, and that's great. And I really appreciate the mentors as well. Again, I will not forget to thank our IAB, who are all of our industry members, Kyokusha, Seagate, and Fujitsu, and also our advisory committee members. Some of them have been on and off this call, this session, but they're also really helpful in helping us with our strategic planning, and I want to thank them for the support that they give us. And last but not least, our behind the scenes our behind the scenes like big thinker, Lavinia, who supported me on every small things and big things. And the biggest aspect was the registration page. So all that going smoothly. And also probably the most impressive was, of course, the merchandise that I just showed you, which is all her artwork. So I really appreciate Lavinia. And normally you would have been seeing Lavinia running around, you know, making sure everything was going well during the conference as the event planner. This year she wasn't quite as there. We're all remote, but so you didn't see her as much, but she's definitely been there the whole time behind the scenes and helping me out. So I really appreciate Lavinia this year. I always appreciate Lavinia, but especially this year has been helpful. And I do appreciate the fact that that we now have great merchandise with really beautiful artwork on it. So thank you to Lavinia, and thank you to everyone else. Now, I think it's time to shift over to our keynote. So I want to first introduce our keynote, and then he has a pre-recorded presentation, so will be available on the minutes to answer questions throughout the talk. So Heath Arensen is the Director of Sustainability at the UN Foundation's Digital Impact Alliance, their open source center, which supports digital public goods through business and community governance advisory services, access to volunteer mentor programs, grants for critical infrastructure development, and outreach. Now, Heath's experience includes founding startups in impact investing and in product incubation. I met Heath last year, about 1 year ago, at the Google Summer of Code Summit that we were both at. And then a few months back, I think it was, he posted a really great article that outlined what digital public goods software projects need to do to be scalable and suitable or sustainable. And I really thought that was a great topic to talk about here today. So I asked him to come and speak on that topic. So I appreciate Heath being able to do that. And I will now share my screen and run the video. So hold on one second while I get that set up.
Hey, my name is Heath Arensen. I'm excited to be giving the keynote today on a subject hopefully you'll all find very interesting. It's open source, which of course we all love, but as a way of looking at open source a little bit differently. So I work for the UN Foundation's Digital Impact Alliance, and we've been working for the last 3 years to really kind of think about how should the greater UN system, social good organizations, large international NGOs and donors, how should they think about supporting open source, and really what is the promise that open source has in all of the kind of technical developments and trends that we've seen in open source. How can we kind of harness those for social good? So I think it's a very interesting conversation because it ties together a lot of all of our interests. It ties together, a passion for open source, a passion for technology, but also ties into social good. What can we do to make the world a better place? So we're going to just share a little bit about what makes these types of software projects a little bit different. What makes them worth supporting? Should we even support them? What does it look like? And then we'll kind of go into some details of what we as an organization have begun to do to begin to maintain and work towards sustainability of these projects. And while you might be coming from an infrastructure project or working with something kind of in the middle of a tech stack, this might not feel as relevant, but it is relevant. It is very interesting. And then kind of at the end, we're going to just kind of, look towards the future and say, what does it look like for governments to look at their, their critical infrastructure, not just their infrastructure, but all the applications that they use, and be able to kind of share that across, municipal governments, city governments, national governments, internationally. Can we start to look at applications as open sourced shared value tools that can be through community supported, etc. So again, thanks for the opportunity to be able to share today. I'll be here during the presentation through the chat. Very happy to kind of address questions as we go along. So open source software is widely used by governments and programs that are addressing the sustainable development goals. So the UN system uses the sustainable development goals to kind of give us as countries a target for a number of objectives in international development, things that we want to see as being better. So open source has a lot of promise. Open source promises things. It says, like, we can build something, we can share something, we can give it freely, and this is particularly appealing to those in the social sector and those in government. So this is the idea of public money building something. It makes sense that it should not be proprietary, and if it was proprietary, who would own it and who would control it? So there has been, for many years, this notion that in the public sector we should be embracing open source, and we work specifically in the international development sector and with international donors who are supporting governments and social good organizations. And have embraced open source for many years because of its promise. So in this program, we're going to jump back and forth between just looking at the idea of open source and this term digital public goods. So digital public goods is a term we started to use in the last year or two to really kind of define kind of clearly this class of open source products that we're talking about. And it really kind of captures this idea, very good of like, what we are trying to create are these large shared applications that are a public good. And in many ways, their funding comes from public funds. And so that's a word that we're going to kind of use between this. There's a real movement inside of the UN system to not only create software to accelerate social change, but to really invest in open source. And so, right up at the very top, the UN Secretary General has put out this year his roadmap for digital cooperation. And their very first recommendation was for the creation of an alliance to support digital public goods. And so there's a number of organizations, some that we work with very closely, that we collaborate with, that are working towards making this a reality. So we've put up here on the slide a number of these digital public goods. You may recognize them. You might not, but it's definitely worth taking a look, Googling around, getting to know them. These are outstanding projects that are doing great things, and there might be ways for you to volunteer and contribute to them. So despite the investments in open source in the international development sector, they've struggled, and they've struggled for a number of reasons. And so the unit that I work for, the Open Source Center at the Digital Impact Alliance, was set up, it was imagined about 5 years ago, but we've been operating for about 3. And it was set up just to be able to think about these problems that the projects are struggling with. And if you think about it, it's intuitive why these projects are struggling. The starting place is they're big. They're surprisingly large. Very often they're applications that were created for a social mission. So let's imagine, for example, there's a problem. A country of Ethiopia needs a software system to manage their immunization supply chain. Like, great, okay, well let's go and see what software kind of exists out there that could do this. And there's nothing really off the shelf that you could take. So okay, we got to build our own. Let's take some open source tools, let's build on them, let's create this application. And this application is for immunization supply chain. So we built it for one country. This is where the problem begins to start. And it was actually a pretty big investment, a pretty nice piece of software. But really, at this point, all it actually is custom application, is a custom software. It's been built. They may slap a license onto it, but it's not documented. There's no community. It's not shared. And this is kind of our starting point. So what's been happening is now another country comes and says, we would like to also have immunization supply chain software. To manage our product. So we got a whole other, the country of Indonesia, for example. So we want to do the same thing. So what do? They build it too, and another country builds it too. So all these countries are building the same thing over and over. So there's a lack of coordination saying, you know what? We already built it over there. We already built it over there. So that's kind of a starting point of the problem, is that things are being built over and over and over. And I wouldn't even say that they're really open source until a community has formed and it's kind of shared widely and broadly. But because these are applications, and they're very customized applications, and because they need more than just technical. So in the case of immunization supply chain software, you need somebody in the country talking to the governments, helping them configure it, talking to doctors and nurses and the pharmaceutical companies. Who does all that? Who owns this? Does this vision really work, where we can mix the ideas of open source software with all the other things that it needs? And there's no surprise it is a problem. However, if we can solve this, if we can figure out how to take all these lessons that we've learned in open source, expand them a little bit more widely to take on the other organizational activities that need to happen to make them really thrive, we can do some great things. And this is where I see a whole new class of products kind of coming out there that are that can be competitive with proprietary systems, and it can kind of unlock sharing between governments. So that's what we're working on. But right now, here's the status. The World Bank says only 13% of public sector ICT projects in developing countries are successful, and most fail because of lack of money. There's other problems as well, like no real kind of community governance takes place for the open source project to really get going. And it's unclear who owns it. And we'll look into that a little bit deeper. So from our point of view, the projects that our center looks to support, is very important to kind of see, where do we kind of put our focus? And so we've basically done two things. So if you look over on the right on the slide, we have what we call foundational open source. You know all these projects. They are used by all of us as the foundational building blocks of so many open source projects and applications. That's not who we work with. We feel like they're important. We use them. We cheer for them. But that's not our focus. Now, if you look over at the left, we begin to see the types of projects that we work with. So, by and large, they're applications, complete end-to-end applications, and they're very directly focused on a social objective, which we define as the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. And so when we look at a project, we basically going to map it out and say, how mature is it in terms of its ability to sustain itself, maintain, make money, etc. And then how focused is it explicitly on the SDGs. And you look at the orange in the middle, that's kind of like our sweet spot, which we call the Digital Public Goods Foundation, the idea of an accelerator. That's where we kind of put a lot of our focus. Over on the right are projects that we would care about, but they're a little bit further along. They've pretty much figured out their own sustainability, often with a partnership with an organization that can play some functions and roles around financing and activities. We also don't work in innovation, so we don't care a lot about brand new things. We think they're important, but there's so many of them come in, and there's there's hackathons and accelerators and innovation funds and all sorts of things that can bring things into the world. What we really kind of focus on are those that do exist and are struggling. So just to kind of give a snapshot of what kind of projects we're talking about, what do they do? So I'll just kind of read these off kind of quickly. And again, I encourage you to take some time, research them, find ways to connect with them. Many of them have gone through the work of being able to take volunteer contributions, and they're always looking to kind of grow the community. So, Primero is a great project that we work with very closely. That works in child protection, social services. Open MRS is one of the larger digital public goods, very well known, focused on medical records. They have a very robust community globally. Mojo Global, for those of you who are interested in climate change, they have an outstanding land management tool called Flint, which is in the Linux Foundation, and is a really outstanding project if you're interested in that. MIFOS, focused on banking, everything from microfinance banks to larger banks who are looking for a core banking system built in open source. They're tied into the Fineract program at the Apache Foundation. Mojaloop, which is a new and very exciting, very interesting. If you're into crypto, sometimes it's a little bit interesting, but it's a payment settlement platform that allows for movement of money between national banks and mobile network operators, with a lot of focus right now in Africa. ODK is very well known, used a lot for data collection. DHIS2 is probably the largest digital public good. It's been supported at the University of Oslo for a very long time, focused on health information. Civil registration, Open CRVS, really important system being developed to be able to, so many countries don't have birth records, just basic records. So it's a system for them to be able to do that. Open LMIS, we'll take a little bit of a deeper look in that as we go along. But they pharmaceutical supply chain and MOSIP, national ID. So this is just a kind of a snapshot of some of the projects that are out there. But thinking about where these projects start, where they begin, is very, very important because it's different than other open source. So most open source, you've heard like, you scratch an itch or you start it in the garage. It's very often this image of, one person solving their technical challenge. And then others saying, oh, that's useful because it solves my challenge too. And then they begin to collaborate, community starts, and it builds from there. This is very different because it doesn't start with a technical need, and very often it doesn't start with a technical person. It starts with a social objective. It starts with a social need. And very often coming out of a large nonprofit, they say, we need to solve X problem, and we find that a digital tool focused on this will help us get there faster. So that's how these ideas start. And then they go out and they look for money to fund it. So this is not the startup world. This is not VC money. It's not even volunteer. It's looking for large grants to be able to fund the initial development of these projects. And then they start. And almost always, it might seem like a strange thing, but they almost always start inside of universities and nonprofits. It might seem strange, but it actually makes a lot of sense because those two types of organizations, number one, are focused on social good. Number two, they are able to accept large grants and donations. This is one of the things that is probably most important in this sector, is that those who are giving large amounts of international money have very strict audit requirements that most organizations just don't have the capability and the capacity to be able to process. And so universities, large NGOs are able to process them. So then they start to build it, they put it on the market, they test it, they release it under an open source license, everything is going well. A community begins to form, commercial partners say, hey, this is useful, let me build some value on top of that. It begins to grow, they don't necessarily contribute back. And then we find ourselves in the valley of death. So the valley of death is something that's, a phrase that's commonly used in startup investing, etc. We look at it a little bit differently. So we look at it as the point when the grant funding is beginning to dry up. Nobody wants to grant something forever. They see it as a initial investment, a catalyst for growth. But that grant money is not going to stay along forever. The problem is this is not a business. It's not a startup. And so the money doesn't follow with it. Very often the initial developers are being paid. Because it started inside of a nonprofit, they paid an external company to build it. And that external company is not as invested as an open source community might be. So then we find these projects, they've run out of money. Those who have built it are not active contributors inside of the community. And they really, really kind of struggle to meet scale. So what do we do with that? So that's the problem that we're trying to solve. That's kind of the world that we find ourselves in. Let's look at the same thing, but looking at the project OpenLMIS, just to give a real kind of snapshot into what an organization like this would look like. So there is a need in Africa for supply chain systems to move healthcare pharmaceuticals. A lot of large nonprofits are in the health space. They're having to move goods to where people are. And a number of organizations found that they were working on the same problem and could not find an off-the-shelf solution, and were beginning to build their own. This is where their kind of first success started. They said, instead of us each building our own, why don't we build something in common? And so, so a number of organizations, kind of led by, Rockefeller, USAID, and Gates said, hey, we're gonna throw some money at this. And then others, Chemonics, ThoughtWorks, Path, Chai, and an organization called Village Reach said, we're going to all collaborate on this together, and we're going to build, a common tool. So far so good. Village Reach, an NGO based out of Seattle, was able to accept funding, was able to pay the developers, was able to build the product, and kind of bring it out to market. Again, shared it under an open source license. A community began to form who were doing implementation, so country level implementation, several $1 million per implementation. So there's some value there for the consultants who are implementing it. And then very common is, it's been out in the market place for a little while. People are using it. Time for a rebuild. So there's still some money around. They come back, they rebuild it, and they release a really pretty great and outstanding product into the marketplace. However, it's not a marketplace that has payers. It was not organized in the beginning to think about how would somebody pay for this. And if you're coming from the open source world, even the concept of paying for something, what would they pay for? Well, there are costs, but are there the technical costs? What costs are they? So OpenLMIS finds himself in this really kind of interesting place where they created a great product. It's out there in the world doing great things. They've created a very robust community, but they don't know how to sustain themselves. So that's the kind of thing we're going to look at today, is how do we sustain these types of projects? And again, it's the open source plus other things, and the other things can sometimes be the more costly thing and the more challenging to support. So how many of these projects are out there? The honest truth is we don't know. We work at the Open Source Center with about 40 of them. We've tried to make an exhaustive list. We have 134 on that list. But the real reality is that there, for however many there are today, if we can find a way to really sustain them, a lot more will kind of come to the table. And what I mean is that, as we said in the beginning, there's been investments in building custom software by organizations for social change. But like most custom software that's built there, it's just there, it's inside of that organization. So how do we, if we came and said like, hey, give us that software, and let's turn it into a digital public good. And then instead of you having your annual cost to maintain that, you can just kind of share that across other organizations. So that's something that we're actively working on. And we think it'll lead to a much greater number of projects. And then we also want to see is like how valuable are these things? Like, how big is it? So like $76 million, what is that? So that's using a method of looking at lines of code to see the value that's created in one digital public good. $76 million. How much money did it take to kind of get it to that value? About $10 million. So the donors invested about $10 million. Very close to a 10x, increase in value because of the volunteers that have been able to come. But that's just kind of giving you a sense of scale of what size some of these projects are. There's a lot of different types of open source projects. When we're looking at applications in our sector, really kind of two main types kind of emerge, right? And most of us kind of understand how these are different. So the first is a single trusted vendor, and the second is like a true community open source project. So in the single trusted vendor, there's one organization. Usually it's figured out a way to build some value on top of it. SaaS or a consulting model or some kind of model that they built on top of the open source. I'm talking about open source business models. Very often they're a trusted vendor. While the software is free for anybody to pick up and build on, really there's only one real organization that's kind of setting the vision, leading the governments, the roadmap, etc. So we see a lot of that. On the other side, there's community open source. So community open source is really what we want. We really want to have this, neutral, decentralized, free, and a community that's vibrant. And maybe there'll be different versions of it, but we will have this true kind of shared, common digital public good. That's really what we want. So what's keeping projects from doing that? And I don't think this is true just in the international development space. I think it's true globally in open source. When a business model is kind of necessary to kind of move the size of because of the size of the project and the non-technical things that have to happen for its success, most common in applications, not infrastructure, a single trusted vendor is a little bit more common because they can have a business, a startup, they can build money on top of it. And so a question we're starting to ask is that good? Is that okay? Or is there another way that we can find to maintain and sustain these core open source projects, these digital public goods, which will allow them to remain community driven? And we think if we can achieve that, we'll be much better off. So as we know, open source relies on a diverse community. It's not really owned by one organization, entity, person, etc. While the intellectual property might be held, a community-led organization really does have a diverse set of stakeholders, and common to sustain, and their identification of who are these stakeholders. We use the maintainers, contributors, sustainers, and consumers as the different kind of players who are involved. In our space, there's a couple of organizations who are playing a coordinating role. There's not a dedicated software foundation for digital public goods. We think there should be one. A lot of the rest of my presentation will be the argument for one. But in the meantime, there's ourselves, an organization called Digital Square, which is focused on health, and the Digital Public Goods Alliance, which is looking at kind of building an alliance of all the digital public goods and those who are invested in together. Very, very good effort. So looking back at us, like what do we do at the Open Source Center? What are we doing to try to make these projects stronger, more sustainable? So this is what we do. When we started, we're like, they need help. So we're going to do two things. One is we're going to kind of work very deeply with some individual projects to learn as much as we can in sustaining them. So consulting, advising, etc. We're going to kind of connect them into mentor programs. So, very active as an umbrella organization instead of Google Summer of Code. That's been outstanding. Our projects who have been unable to kind of easily bring on volunteers after they go through the program are now able to have start to build a volunteer community. We give small grants. So we start with a fund where we could give grants. These grants are very kind of focused on identifying ways that we can help the projects kind of work together, create interoperability, document their code, just anything to kind of make it more shareable. Very often things that would be kind of a little bit lower on their priority list internally, but from the point of view of others who might be using it, would be of high value. So in the last 3 years as we've been working, we've learned a lot of things by going really deep. At the same time, we've been trying to take a high-level view of all of the kind of digital public goods that are out there. What do they universally need? And we're kind of moving those two things. And in both, we're starting to coalesce on this idea of the need for a software foundation for digital public goods. And the question is, well, why? There's existing fiscal sponsors out there. Why wouldn't we use those? Well, the answer is, a lot of our projects should go join those fiscal sponsors. But what we're trying to really kind of get at is to say that there's things beyond just the technical or just the governance that these projects need, and having an organization that can take on more of them. So we're using the word foundation for lack of a better word. There needs to be something, and we'll get deeper into what that something is. So again, this is how we work. If you guys know of any kind of digital public goods, we'd love to get to know them. We'd love to kind of bring them on as members. Membership in the Open Source Center is very simple. It's just about getting on our mailing list, participating in our forums. Once you're kind of in, we just kind of make sure that you are, generally fit the criteria. Then you have the ability to apply to grants, apply to Google Summer of Code, etc. So I'll show at the end, ways that you can kind of get in contact with us. But one of the things that we do, and we've really become a lot more systematic in how we do that, is our consulting for sustainability. And so in that, we now have a workbook that has a number of workshops that we kind of work through that first kind of evaluates the project on like a maturity model, and then moves into most of the work actually has to do around financial models. What are the different revenue streams that might be able to support this project? Can they go through this organization, or how do the different community members all kind of fit together so that revenue is being generated and either volunteer contributions or money is able to flow back to the kind of core project. So consulting is still a big part of what we do at the Open Source Center. Again, we give grants. We're actively raising money for our grant pool. So if anybody is interested, it happens to come from an organization that's figuring out how do we give to open source. I think we're becoming very opinionated about how we give money, how we prioritize features and tasks, and then how we fund them. And then again, we run these support programs for projects. So let's take a step back and look at these digital public goods. And we found it's very helpful to kind of look at them in their different growth phases. And so we got the 4 main phases. You start in the idea phase, move into an innovation phase, and there's the growth, and then the mature phase. And the hardest thing to do is to move from the innovation phase into the growth phase. So idea phase is fun. That's when you just have an idea, right? And everybody loves good ideas. We come up with them. In our organization inside of Dial, we are the stewards of what's called the Principles for Digital Development, which is kind of a set of best practice design principles for when you start a new kind of digital initiative that targets a social outcome. It's a very good starting point to make sure you start at the beginning. Then is the innovation phase. The innovation phase is fun. It's where you get to experiment. It's when you get to fail. That's where I say, oh, you get to fail fast. Let's build something. Let's try it. Let's iterate it. So if you're working in innovation, that's kind of, it's fun and it's exciting. The real hard thing to do is to move something out of innovation and into growth. and then into maturity. So our focus has not been on innovation. We're like, get your act together, prove out a model, build something. And there's a lot of support organizations that help in innovation, et cetera. We're much more focused on how do we bring something to scale, and in bringing it to scale, how do we create those support structures that are really kind of necessary for it to be maintained in the long run. And so more than we look at open source, sometimes we look at big tech to say like, how well, big tech has software and they know how to maintain it. How do they maintain it? They maintain it by having budgets for it, by going out and having certifications, networks of developers. We try to think of all the different things that are necessary to really keep a software project good and healthy, and say how can we replicate that while keeping the open source core, while keeping the neutrality, but still recognizing that money, and sometimes a lot of money, has to flow through this project in order for it to really successfully accomplish its social mission. So these are the things that we're really starting to think about. And for our types of projects, we've kind of identified 5 things that we feel are really important for them to thrive. So when we work with a project, we sit down with them and they say, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? And you need to identify how these things will get done if you want to even have the baseline for being able to thrive. So the first is a fiscal home. You need to have some kind of a legal organization that can hold the IP, enter into contracts, hire people, etc. The fiscal sponsors that are available can do these things. But so many organizations or projects that we're working with, because they started inside of that university or that nonprofit, that organization is wanting to, like they use the words all that, spin it off. We're not a software company. We don't want to hold this long enough. We can't run a business. Like, we can't do this stuff. We want to spin it off. And so projects are coming to us in that state. So they're struggling. They need to be spun off. Their founding organization is no longer interested in them. And so we really have to identify, well, what fiscal home? Who will play that fiscal role? The second is related. It's actually the vision. Who will be the primary maintainer? We found that if there's not like somebody kind of stepping up to the plate saying like, we own this vision, we're moving towards it, we're going, it's going to be a lot harder. So identify who's going to kind of lead the community governance, who's going to kind of develop all the systems, the tools, and the processes, the community, like the product roadmap, etc. We need to identify who that's going to be. The next is a dedicated product team. This is actually fairly important, and it comes with how these projects were started. Again, they weren't started by passionate volunteers who said, I believe in building this, and they stay with the project. They were very often contracted out to companies that just did the work for hire. And what ends up happening is, because these projects are sometimes quite large, having developers who know the project, who are engaged in the project, is very challenging. And what we found is that if you can at least find a way to have a small dedicated product team, maybe a community manager, an architect, some developers, just a very core team, then you can be able to unlock a whole bunch more in terms of volunteer contribution, etc. And so that's something that we go a little bit deeper into than maybe an infrastructure open source project might have, that could rely on a community to be able to contribute a little bit more. The other is access to core funding. You need to know where your money is coming from, and it has to be pretty reliable. And the reason is that governments are taking on these projects. They're saying like, I have to procure software for, like, let's say my national ID system. And so there's a whole bunch of proprietary systems that are out there that says, yeah, we'll sell it to you and we'll support it and it's going to cost X. And then we say, oh, there's an open source solution and it's good. It's really good. How can they select that if they do not know that it's going to be sustained, that there's going to be future releases, that there's going to be support if something breaks, somebody can come and take it? All of those things need to be built. It's much harder in a kind of community open source kind of environment to be able to do that. So starting with like identifying where's that money going to come from, and that's a challenge. It could be from revenue. It could be from organizations that have committed long-term grant funding to them. And then the last is a community of practice. We should all learn from each other. There's a lot of us who are building similar things. We should learn from each other. Here's a little bit of a kind of a deep look into how we're trying to think about those kind of core maintaining costs. And so we've kind of broken down like what are the different costs that might kind of come into a digital public good. So the top of the purple are what we call community created value. So these are usually like consultants or SaaS companies, anybody who's kind of using that software, building some business of it, some commercial revenue. And these can be, quite big. So that's the, most money that's going to flow into the project is flowing to those. The challenge there is that that money doesn't flow then back to the core project if the project needs money. The hope in good governance is that some money might flow back, some contributions might flow back. But what we found is that there's a lot of free riders. This is a challenge in markets where there might be some commercial value, but yet there's not really enough. There's just kind of a competition for very scarce resources. And then maintaining the core becomes a lot more challenging. So then, down at the bottom of the slide, we look at the core. We have something called operational support. Those are kind of like the non-technical things that are necessary just to kind of keep that thing running. Core maintenance is like the basic minimum technical investment we could do on a year-to-year just to kind of keep it up to date, building out the releases, and then above that, a feature backlog. And so what we've tried to do is just say like, what's the minimum that we can look at, and why this is important is that if we can figure out how to support the core, if we can figure out how to support the minimum, we can maintain the community nature of it. They're less likely to have to revert to a single vendor, open source business model, etc. And so we're putting together this vision where we say like, the international donor community who has invested in these projects should continue to invest in them at least at this minimum level, because this is the minimum viable that we can really guarantee that this project will be available for governments. People can pick it up and use it. It will be supported, and we can build value on top of that. And once we have that core, if we can have a very robust community growing and scaling over time, there will be more contributions back, both in terms of money and code. We'll take a little bit of look at how we're doing this. So we actually do think that we have to put together teams. They don't necessarily have to be in one organization. It could be distributed and it could be made up of volunteers, but you got to identify them. You got to say there is a core team and they're really important for this project. And by having them, making sure that they are, maybe, and this might feel like it's kind of, against some of the ethos of open source, and we don't understand the challenges there. But there needs to be at least a core that can reliably get paid each month and can contribute to the project. There's different ways that can happen, but we're focused on just like a mini core, and then everything else kind of coming out from there. So this is how we see a foundation kind of coming together. We recognize that a lot of projects are already inside of foundations, fiscal sponsors, but they need some of these other roles, these non-technical support roles, dedicated product teams, the ability for somebody to kind of enter into contracts on their behalf. So one of our projects is a member of a very well-known fiscal sponsor. And they have been offered, they have been asked by the World Bank if they can implement their software in multiple countries around the world. It's a very valuable piece of software, and into projects that could be $50 to $100 million. And now imagine you're an open source project, as we understand an open source project, and now someone's coming to you and saying, we have $100 million and we want this software to be implemented in every country, but yet you don't have a network of implementers yet. You don't have commercial entities who are out building, like who will enter into those contracts? Who will, and that's a lot of money. So so this is something that we're starting to build out. Like we need to be able to think big. We need to be able to interface with these large organizations that are making pretty substantial global investments. We do believe that open source can be the core of that, but they can't just go to the open source project. That's just not the nature of it. And so what we're trying to do is maintain the open source nature of a project by building an organization on top of it that is strong enough to be able to enter into these contractual relationships while maintaining the neutrality of the core project. So that's the vision that we're working towards. These are a number of the things that we feel should be inside of that organization. So the first is the Open Source Resource Center. This is something that we've already built. This is the thing that we've been running. We've got our budget up there. We think it's very, very valuable to have a support organization to do that. We do think that there needs to be some kind of a lab, mostly around ideas of interoperability. We have this project and this project. How can we get them to work together? How can we go out together and build kind of common value? We think our micro grants program is very good and can be a foundation for being able to move more significant amounts of money to feature development in digital public goods. But we also think that there's a role for multiple platforms. We do think that there is a role for volunteer platforms, for a platform for the micro grants, so we can have a backlog of all the fundable the backlog of a task list and have it organized in a way that somebody can come and find it, prioritize it, fund it. Even cloud infrastructure, is there a role for shared? We'll go into a lot more detail on why we think that's important to be able to have that shared. And the last is the ability to have managed core teams to be able to share them across projects and take advantage that way. So we're going to kind of go quickly through this. If you're actually interested in how we're kind of imagining setting up a foundation like this, love for you to kind of get in contact, send us an email, talk more about this. But we really we do see the creation of a membership organization, probably not a C6, probably a C3 or something similar, is very kind of important. But understanding that the primary members are actually those who are investing in the projects. They're not the projects themselves. So unlike a lot of foundations who rely on corporate members, we don't have a lot of corporate members. What we do have is the international development community, both donors and large NGOs, who may be invested in different digital projects, and so their participation in the foundation it would give them access to support for the investments that they're already making. And we do see that as the foundational source of funds for this initial organization. The digital public goods can also come in as members. We feel like most of them should come in as free members. Most of the projects are connected to some international donor or NGO who invested them initially. So they already do kind of have a connection to somebody who is a paying member, but they themselves would come in as free. And then for our other things, fiscal sponsor and primary maintainer, just kind of budgeting for that. So we have a menu of services that these projects could access through membership with us. We're also able to create essentially a sub-foundation or account for each project, similar to other software foundations, which would allow them to raise money, have memberships, even do some revenue generating activities. And these are the different things that we think that they can do. What we're working on for each digital public good is just kind of a minimal amount. We feel like targeting about $500,000 a year will keep each project independent. Again, these are big projects, so that might seem like a lot of money, but it really isn't, given how much money kind of flows to them to begin with. Membership commitments will be a big part of that. We're also looking to doing some advocacy for the donors to be able to find ways to give money in the long term, maybe even tying it to a percentage of implementations that they're also funding. But then some other revenue models for them as well, which might include consulting and SaaS versions, things that you might find in a common open source business model. The real trick here is in figuring out which things belong in a community project, which things are done by community members, which things are done by a foundation, and doing it in a way that maintains the collaborative, free nature of the project. So how can you get involved? We'd love to hear from you. First, just getting feedback on our project, on what we're doing. We'd love to hear from you. there are opportunities to volunteer. A number of the projects are looking for volunteers. We highly recommend the OVO platform. A number of our projects are already on there. Go check it out, find ways to contribute, volunteer. And then also join our forums. We'd love to kind of hear from you, hear your thoughts. If you know of projects or you are a project that you feel might be a digital public good that could be used for social good, we'd also love to hear from you. So I'm very happy to answer any questions, but that's the end of the core presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Heath. I'm going to open it up for questions. We have a couple minutes for the group. Is there anyone that has questions for Heath? We had a few back and forth in the minutes, but then I could highlight some of that as well. Let's see. Oh, sorry. Go for it, Jeff.
Okay. Hi, thanks, Heath. That was really interesting. I had a quick question. Near the end, you showed a valley of death there, and it was for, I think this was for digital public goods services, or could you maybe just elaborate a little bit on what is that, why is that there, and is it a characteristic of that type of project only?
Yeah, so Valley of Death is an idea that's kind of more borrowed from like startups. So this is something that would be kind of more business oriented or than open source. But what we find in our projects is that it's very often technology plus something else. So when you have that something, you need that extra thing. They'll face the same challenges, but maybe even more, maybe even worse. And so what we see is, so like in the case of like, let's just say a hospital management system that is designed for Africa. You can build the technology that can be very clean, that can be very clear. The technologists and the contributors all work and they build it. But then on the other side, that piece of software actually has to take a life in the real world. Somebody has to get on an airplane, talk with the government or entity that might be implementing it, train people, support people, etc. So all of those things have costs. And the challenge that we're kind of facing is that those who are investing in kind of the whole package, let's bring this new solution to hospital solution to African governments. They have a nonprofit mindset, which is not bad. But then they kind of they still kind of buy into this idea of open source that, once we kind of, put it out to the world, a community will magically kind of happen, and then that'll kind of bring it to life, which in a sense might happen for the technology, but it doesn't fully happen for that whole package. And that's why it can also kind of face this valley of death. And so the challenge that happens is that it ends up being grant funded at the beginning, and that grant funding can be quite a lot. It can be $2 million, $3 million, $4 million, which, for any open source project, I'd like raise my hand, sign me up for that. I'd love to be paid to bring it into the world. But a lot of that money is actually going into, what it would take to, fly across the world and implement it in real life. So the challenge that then happens is that the original funders of it are saying, well, we've built this product. Why, and it's open source, why doesn't it just kind of stand on its own, right? So it faces some sustainability challenges that might be even greater than a typical open source project might have. And that's why we kind of focus on it and really kind of say like, well, if the money stops, where's the money going to come from for all those extra things that need to happen? So what I do think is kind of useful thinking here is for us to say, what are all those other open source things that we're building and that we love? And for them to be world changing, there has to be something else on top of it, some kind of organization, some other activities that need to happen to really, have it continue to build life. And then whatever conversations we're having about sustaining the software side, what are the other conversations that we have to have on sustaining the other things, which in some ways could be a lot more costly because they kind of come together in a package if they're going to be the most successful. So that's why we use that valley of death, and it is a valley of death.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was muted. I think we have one question in the chat, and I think that might be the only question we can take within this session, but we could move either back to the minutes if people have further questions, and Heath could answer it there, or in the Slack channel. So, but James had a question for you. Do you see it right there on the chat? On just the regular Zoom chat, sorry.
Oh yeah. How would you say this relates to how the Apache Foundation talks about making the world a better place and community over code, and tries to create an umbrella for all open source projects in the Apache way? Is there a digital goods way? Yeah, Jan, I think you're starting to get onto it. I think one of the first things that we looked at when we started was looking at existing kind of software foundations. Because these foundations started to exist because open source needed something. So to be able to kind of keep that, that real ethos and the neutrality and, the beautiful things of open source, the foundations emerged. And they emerged around, I think a certain type of open source project, which I would define as probably being packaged a little more technical in nature. And while it could be applications, it's often more infrastructure. And very often there is a community that the community that's using it, engaged in it, has technologists on their team, which helps for their ability to contribute back, etc. But when we expand that to things that are a little bit larger and outside of the technology realm, I feel like it starts to break down a little bit. And so what we really do want to do is take the best parts of why the Apache Foundation was kind of created to begin with, and to say that these digital public goods, they need a little bit more, they're a little bit different. We could go into it a little bit more deeply, but the fact that these products, international development, are tied to these large international donors who have a very kind of systematic and unchanging kind of way of working and investing in projects. Having an organization that can essentially do that dirty work of interfacing with them, maintaining the neutrality, and then having that open source community be able to thrive underneath that. I think that's what we kind of need to work towards, and I think we are working towards it. I know, James, I know you personally, I know you're working towards this. And so, yeah, I do think there needs to be a digital goods way.
Great, thanks. I do want to wrap up this session, at least the official discussions here, because we have our next session starting in about 5 minutes, and I want to give everybody kind of a chance to have a quick break. So thanks so much, Heath. If you want to stay online, I could put people in breakout rooms, or you can continue having a little bit of a conversation unofficially, I guess, in the next on this session and before the next one starts. But thanks again. Thanks for joining us. It was definitely a very interesting talk. Oh.
Thanks, Abby.